There is a kind of emptiness that does not come from failure. It comes from movement without meaning. From waking up, doing what is required, answering messages, paying bills, meeting expectations, carrying responsibilities, and still feeling as if something essential is missing. You can be productive and still feel hollow. You can be admired and still feel directionless. You can look disciplined from the outside and still sense, in the quieter corners of your mind, that your life is being spent rather than truly lived. This is one of the deepest pains a human being can experience, because it is not loud enough to be called tragedy, yet not quiet enough to be ignored. It follows you into the morning, into the late evening, into the silence after achievement. It asks one persistent question: what is all of this for? Most people answer that question too quickly. They say purpose is success, or legacy, or happiness, or money, or impact, or passion. But these answers, though seductive, often collapse under pressure. Success can leave you empty. Money can make life easier without making it meaningful. Passion can disappear when difficulty arrives. Happiness is too unstable to serve as a compass. And impact, if pursued carelessly, can become another performance designed to make you feel significant in the eyes of others. Philosophers understood this long before the modern world built an economy around distraction. They knew that purpose is not something you stumble into by accident. It is not a mood. It is not a slogan. It is a disciplined relationship with truth, value, suffering, mortality, and action. The modern world does not help you find purpose. It teaches you how to be occupied. It rewards reaction over reflection, speed over depth, visibility over integrity, stimulation over understanding. It fills your attention with borrowed desires and then convinces you the resulting confusion is your fault. You scroll through other people's identities, absorb other people's ambitions, compare your unseen interior life to their curated surface, and then wonder why your own direction feels blurred. What nobody talks about is that purposelessness is often not a lack of options. It is a lack of stillness, a lack of confrontation with yourself, a lack of moral seriousness about how you are actually using your life. Philosophers were not interested in helping you feel vaguely inspired for a weekend. They were interested in asking whether your life could withstand honest examination, whether your actions matched your values, whether your daily rhythm reflected what you claimed to believe, whether your mind belonged to you or to appetite, fear, vanity, and imitation. They did not separate purpose from character. In fact, they would likely say that most people fail to find purpose because they are looking for an emotional high instead of a worthy way to live. They want meaning to arrive as excitement, certainty, or recognition. But often it arrives as responsibility, as clarity, as quiet alignment, as the difficult decision to stop living by impulses that no longer deserve authority. The first secret philosophers knew is that purpose is not found by asking, "What do I want from life?" It begins when you ask, "What does life require of me if I want to live honestly?" That question is heavier, less glamorous, but far more real. It shifts the center of gravity. Instead of treating life like a market where you search for a role that flatters you, you begin treating it like a moral landscape where your choices matter. What kind of human being must you become to meet life well? What must you cultivate? What must you stop pretending not to know? What responsibilities have you been delaying because comfort made delay feel acceptable? These are not trendy questions. They are sobering questions. And that is why they are powerful. Purpose begins to sharpen when you stop searching for the perfect identity and start accepting the discipline of service. Not service in the shallow sense of becoming useful to everyone at the expense of yourself, but service to what is real, good, and necessary. To truth instead of image. To contribution instead of vanity. To craftsmanship instead of applause. To courage instead of avoidance. Many people remain purpose-starved because they are trying to feel important rather than become responsible. Philosophy exposes this gently but mercilessly. It asks whether your life is organized around what matters, or around what merely flatters your ego in the moment. The second secret is that meaning grows through alignment, not intensity. This is where many people get lost. They think a life of purpose must feel dramatic, cinematic, constantly charged with inspiration. They assume that if they have not yet discovered the one grand calling that electrifies every cell in their body, then purpose must still be missing. But philosophers knew better. They knew that a meaningful life often looks repetitive from the outside. Daily disciplines, repeated choices, quiet moral consistency, returning again and again to what is right even when it is inconvenient, uncelebrated, or emotionally unexciting. Meaning is often built in plain sight through repeated alignment between what you know and what you do. You do not need a dramatic revelation to begin living purposefully. You need honesty. If you know you must become more disciplined, begin there. If you know your relationships are built on avoidance, begin there. If you know your attention has been hijacked by distraction, begin there. If you know you have been postponing the one task, conversation, commitment, or change that would restore integrity to your life, begin there. Purpose becomes visible when self-deception starts collapsing. It is very difficult to feel the direction of your life clearly while continuing to betray what you already know. Clarity and avoidance do not live well together. The third secret philosophers understood is that purpose requires voluntary difficulty. This is the part most people do not want to hear. They want meaning without friction. They want growth without sacrifice. They want a life that feels significant without having to become strong enough to carry significance. But every serious philosophy points toward the same truth. What strengthens the soul is rarely what flatters immediate comfort. Courage grows when fear is faced. Discipline grows when impulse is restrained. Wisdom grows when illusion is surrendered. Depth grows when suffering is examined instead of merely escaped. A life of purpose cannot be built entirely out of convenience because convenience rarely asks enough of you. The Stoics in particular understood that difficulty is not an interruption of the meaningful life. It is part of its formation. Marcus Aurelius did not wake each day asking how to avoid discomfort. He asked how to meet his duties with clarity and self-command. Epictetus did not define freedom as the absence of challenge. He defined it as the refusal to let what happens outside you dominate what happens within you. That is a very different kind of power. It means you stop measuring the value of your path by how comfortable it feels and start measuring it by what it asks you to become. This changes everything. Now hardship is not automatically evidence that you are off course. Sometimes it is evidence that life is finally asking more of you. The fourth secret is that purpose and self-respect are deeply connected. A person without purpose often becomes vulnerable to imitation because they do not have a strong internal measure. They borrow goals, borrow ambitions, borrow styles of living, borrow identities that look admirable from a distance. But something remains unstable because what they are pursuing was never truly examined. Philosophers knew that the examined life is not a luxury. It is the only defense against living under the rule of borrowed values. If you do not decide carefully what matters, the world will decide for you. And the world is not particularly concerned with your soul. It is concerned with your attention, your labor, your consumption, your compliance. This is why self-respect begins increasing the moment your life becomes more internally chosen. Not necessarily easier. Not necessarily more glamorous. But more chosen. When your days begin reflecting your real values instead of your fear, your image management, or your habit of drifting, a different kind of stability emerges. You trust yourself more. Not because life becomes simple, but because your actions stop contradicting what you know matters. Self-respect is not only built by confidence. It is built by congruence. By the quiet experience of knowing that your life is becoming harder to manipulate because it is no longer so disconnected from your own convictions. The fifth secret is that mortality clarifies purpose better than motivation ever will. Philosophers spoke about death not because they were morbid, but because they were serious. They knew that the awareness of finitude cuts through vanity. It exposes how much of life is being wasted on things that cannot possibly matter enough to justify the cost. Petty resentments, endless comparison, hollow busyness, the pursuit of approval from people you do not even deeply respect. The performance of a life instead of the living of one. When you remember that your time is not renewable, your decisions become more honest. Urgency enters but not panic. A clear kind of urgency. The kind that asks whether your current way of living deserves the days it is consuming. To live with mortality in view is to stop treating life as if it were infinitely postponable. So many people assume there will be a later version of themselves who finally becomes disciplined, finally leaves what is dead, finally speaks honestly, finally commits to what matters, finally stops wasting time. Philosophy interrupts that fantasy. It reminds you that later is not promised, and worse than death itself is the slow erosion of a life never truly inhabited. A purpose-driven life does not require panic about death. It requires respect for the fact that your life is being spent now, not someday. That thought can feel heavy. But it is also profoundly liberating. The sixth secret is that meaning does not come from self-obsession. This is one of the most overlooked truths in the modern search for purpose. The more you orbit yourself constantly, your mood, your image, your feelings, your brand, your private drama, your personal significance, the harder it becomes to feel grounded meaning. Purpose expands when the self stops being the center of every calculation. Not because the self does not matter, but because a life becomes deeper when it is connected to something beyond vanity. Service, contribution, beauty, truth, wisdom, protection, creation, discipline, moral responsibility, these give the self shape without making it the center of the universe. This is why many people feel strangely empty after achieving things they once thought would save them. The achievement was real, but its center was too narrow. It fed the ego without feeding the soul. Philosophy constantly widens the horizon. It asks what kind of life strengthens not only your image but your character. What kind of work is worth your finite attention? What kind of relationships deserve your loyalty? What kind of habits make you more awake, more honest, more difficult to corrupt from the inside? These questions shift purpose away from spectacle and back toward substance. The seventh secret is that your deepest calling may not begin where you feel most comfortable. It may begin where you feel most resistant. This is because resistance often protects the threshold of necessary growth. The conversation you avoid may contain more purpose than the praise you chase. The discipline you resist may contain more freedom than the indulgence you defend. The solitude you escape may contain more truth than the noise you fill yourself with. Philosophers understood that discomfort often reveals where your life is trying to deepen. Not all discomfort is meaningful, of course, but the discomfort that comes from confronting truth is often the doorway to a more integrated life. You have likely felt this already. The quiet knowledge that there is something you must face, a responsibility you must stop delaying, a habit you must stop romanticizing, a change you must stop treating like a future possibility and start treating like a moral requirement. This is where purpose becomes intensely personal. Not in abstract ideas about destiny, but in the very concrete places where your current life is asking you to become more serious, more disciplined, more honest. The philosopher's secret is not hidden because it is complicated. It is hidden because most people do not want a purpose that asks them to change. The eighth secret is that purpose is sustained by ritual. Not empty routine, but chosen practices that return you to yourself. Reflection, writing, reading, silence, prayer for some, walking without distraction, honest conversation, daily labor done with care, time away from noise, time spent remembering what matters. Without ritual, your life is easily captured by immediacy. The urgent replaces the important. The loud replaces the true. The day fills itself before your deeper mind has had any say in how it should be lived. Philosophers protected their interior lives because they knew that without deliberate return, the world would fragment them. Ritual matters because purpose is not self-sustaining in a distracted culture. It must be re-entered, remembered, recommitted to. This is not weakness. It is realism. You are not a machine that can lock onto truth once and never drift again. You are human. You forget. You get seduced by comfort. You get pulled by noise. You become tired, reactive, scattered, vain, discouraged. Ritual is the structure that catches you before drift becomes destiny. It is the discipline of saying, before the world tells me who to be today, I will remember who I am trying to become. The ninth secret is that purpose often reveals itself more through subtraction than addition. You do not always need a new grand mission. Sometimes you need to remove what is crowding out meaning. The habits that dull your attention. The relationships that shrink your integrity. The endless inputs that scatter your mind. The compulsions that make silence unbearable. The obligations you accepted from guilt, vanity, or fear rather than conviction. A philosopher would tell you that your life becomes clearer not only when you add noble aims, but when you stop feeding what makes nobility harder to sustain. This is one of the reasons simplicity matters so much. Not aesthetic simplicity alone, but moral simplicity. A life in which your values are easier to see because they are not buried under excess. A life where your yes means something because your no has become stronger. A life with fewer internal contradictions. This kind of simplicity is not small. It is powerful. It restores energy. It makes purpose easier to feel because you are no longer being pulled in 20 directions by appetites and obligations that never deserved equal authority. The 10th secret philosophers knew is that purpose is inseparable from suffering properly interpreted. This is where shallow self-help collapses. It tells you that pain means something is wrong with your path. Philosophy says pain may be the place where your path becomes visible. Not all suffering is noble. Some suffering is needless and should be reduced. But there is also suffering that reveals what matters to you, what must change, what must be endured, what must be relinquished, what must be defended. A meaningful life is not one without pain. It is one where pain has not been wasted, that if you suffer and learn nothing, the suffering hardens you or hollows you. If you suffer and examine it honestly, it can deepen you. It can strip illusion. It can reorder your values. It can reveal who matters, and what no longer deserves your allegiance. Some of the clearest people in history became clear not because life was easy, but because suffering burned away what was false. This is why philosophers did not worship comfort. They knew comfort often protects illusions that only difficulty can expose. So what does a life of purpose actually look like in practical terms? It looks like waking up and remembering that your mind is not to be handed over cheaply. It looks like choosing what matters before distraction chooses for you. It looks like accepting that uncertainty is part of being alive and that meaning is not found by eliminating all risk. It looks like acting in accordance with your values even when no one is watching, no one is applauding, and no one is coming to rescue you from the responsibility of becoming yourself. It looks less cinematic than people imagine, but it feels more solid, more alive, more internally clean. A purposeful life may still contain confusion, grief, mistakes, loneliness, setbacks, and seasons where the path feels obscured. Philosophy does not remove the human condition. It teaches you how to stand inside it without dissolving. That is the real secret. Purpose is not the permanent certainty that you are always doing the exact perfect thing. It is the growing capacity to live in such a way that your days increasingly reflect what you know is true, worthy, and necessary. That kind of life does not depend on constant emotional certainty. It depends on practiced integrity. So if you feel lost, do not begin by asking what glamorous future identity will finally save you. Begin more soberly. Ask where your current life is out of alignment. Ask what truth you already know and keep postponing. Ask where comfort has become a substitute for meaning. Ask what your days are currently serving. Ask whether your habits make you clearer or duller, stronger or softer, freer or easier to control. These questions are not designed to discourage you. They are designed to wake you up. Purpose begins there, in that wakefulness. The philosopher's secret, then, is not really secret at all. It is simply ignored because it asks more of you than inspiration does. A life of purpose is built through truth, discipline, mortality consciousness, chosen responsibility, meaningful suffering, subtraction, ritual, and alignment between values and action. Nobody talks about this enough because it is easier to market dreams than to teach moral seriousness. But moral seriousness is exactly what gives a life weight. It is what turns time into something other than motion. It is what transforms living from performance into presence. You do not need to have everything mapped out today. But you do need to stop living as though drift will somehow become direction on its own. It will not. Drift becomes more drift. Distraction becomes more distraction. Delay becomes identity. At some point, you must decide that your life is too finite to be spent in half-conscious imitation. You must become willing to live deliberately, even before you feel ready, even before everything is clear, even before the world gives you reassurance. Purpose does not always arrive as a sudden revelation. Often it arrives as a decision to stop betraying what you already know matters. And once that decision is made, something quiet but powerful begins to happen. Your days gain shape. Your no becomes cleaner. Your yes becomes more meaningful. Your attention becomes less cheap. Your suffering becomes more instructive. Your solitude becomes less empty. Your work becomes less performative. Your relationships become less confused. The world may remain chaotic, but your life stops feeling so internally scattered. Because purpose is not simply about having a mission. It is about becoming the kind of person whose way of living no longer insults the truth they claim to see. That is the philosopher's secret. And once you begin living it, your life stops feeling like something that is merely happening to you. It starts feeling like something you are finally brave enough to inhabit. If you are ready to stop drifting and start living with purpose, comment now. I choose a life of meaning.